I think, well, if you look at the exact wording of the 5-point agreement, they encourage discussions about disengagement and troop withdrawal, but there's no specific timeline as for when that will happen or when that will have to happen. We know that by October, in about a month, the weather condition in that part of the disputed border will be quite inhabitable. So I hope that the political components, the political agreement, and the weather condition on the ground together will promote a decision by the two militaries to disengage and withdraw. But I have to say that judging from what the Chinese military are trying to do and what the Indian militaries are trying to do, I'm not particularly optimistic this time. So maybe both sides will withdraw the majority of their troops, since tens of thousands of troops are very difficult to supply in that region. But for complete disengagement and complete withdrawal, I'm not particularly confident. I'm even less optimistic about a permanent solution. This issue has existed in 7 decades, and we know that both sides have their historical evidence, have their territorial claims, and have their legitimate claims in their view. So this issue has not been resolved, evidently suggests that there are particular political obstacles and also practical obstacles for both sides. So although this time the tension has escalated to I would say, rather unprecedented level since 1975, I don't expect a permanent solution in a timely manner at all. Well, I have read many papers by distinguished Indian strategists about the issue of line of actual control. And I would say that among the Indian strategists, there's also this recognition that there's not one LAC. There is the Indian LAC, and then there is also, there's the Indian LAC, and there's also the Chinese LAC. And these two lines do not overlap. And in particular, in the Western sector, because troop deployment for the whole year, all year round, the troop deployment is not feasible in the Western sector of the disputed border. That means by the time that the winter begins each year, both sides will withdraw their troops. But it also means that they will both come back the next year. And by the time that they come back, they may not stick to the line where they stationed in the previous year. Instead, they will try to patrol and they will try to advance to the LAC that either side believes that they are entitled to. So I think this issue of the disputed or disagreement over the line of actual control, I think both sides agree is the origin of the re-escalating of tension every year. But then the question is, how could the two sides reach a consensus as for what that line really should be or what it should really look like? And I think there are two approaches. There's a political approach that two sides can negotiate on the negotiation table. Both sides will present their historical evidence, make a legal argument, and try to show that why their claimed line of actual control is more legitimate than the others. But I think the records of such negotiation for this many decades has also suggested that that method is not really working out, because both sides have their evidence, and neither side is able to convince the other side. So the political negotiation has become increasingly impractical, and that leads to the other option, which you mentioned in our last conversation, is also the option that India and Pakistan has adopted in the Kashmir, which is that if a line of actual control cannot be negotiated, it can only be consolidated by the stationing of troops, by the confrontation along the disputed border, so that within these pulling and hauling, both sides will get a clear sense as for where we are and where they are. And in that constant military interaction and almost, I'm sorry to say, standoffs and confrontations, a line of actual control will eventually emerge. I think it's possible, but it's not very probable. But we see that in policy circle, the possibility always exists, but is it probable? I don't think the likelihood is particularly high. I think for one, I don't believe either India or China wants a war with each other along that disputed border. Neither side is seeking a war with the other side in order to achieve certain agendas. So I think both sides are finding themselves in a security dilemma, which means that the increase of the Indian security by troop deployment also increases the Chinese insecurity, and the Chinese will in turn increase their troop deployments so that it can feel a little bit more secure. And that's a classical security dilemma situation that we're looking at here. But I would like to draw the distinction between skirmishes and a conflict or a war. Skirmishes can happen, especially when the troops are deployed so close to each other. Like remember the 10th confrontation from a couple of years ago. So I agree with you. I think the number of troops and how close they are to each other does increase the possibility of a skirmish, of a confrontation on the ground. But I think for those skirmishes to escalate into a full conflict or even a war that involves nuclear weapons, like you just mentioned, that requires political leadership's decision. So I would say a war is a political decision, but skirmishes can happen tactically on the ground. To begin with, the context of this evolution is that back in the 90s, China was keeping a low profile. China was trying to build its domestic strengths, build its comprehensive national power. And I would say that in the 90s and in the early 2000s, neither China nor India sees each other as a significant threat. And it could be because that neither country was at a stage where they felt like a global power, and their global power ambition was not inflated. So on that, I would say that the international financial crisis did give China at that point. We see this quite clearly, starting from 2008, 2009. All the international events give China a inflated sense of empowerment. There was a financial crisis, and China saw itself doing fairly well in the crisis. There was also the Obama administration's inauguration, and during the first year of the Obama administration, the United States had a long list of issues where it was seeking China's cooperation on, from AFPEC to North Korea, from Iran to climate change. So I was based in Beijing at that time, so I knew that all those messages coming from the United States was translated as a signal by the Chinese that, oh, U.S. is weak. U.S. is weakening, and the U.S. now needs our cooperation to address these issues. So I would say that around that time, the Chinese sense of empowerment started to grow. And I think that's also around the time where the Chinese see itself as a growing global presence. And of course, then later in 2013, with the Belt and Road Initiative, we know that the Chinese developed this blueprint in order to go in the Western direction, Central Asia, South Asia, and that inevitably led to the clash with India in the South Asia subcontinent, which India sees as its traditional sphere of influence. So I think, especially coming to China-India relations, the Chinese perception is, well, traditionally, maybe South Asia subcontinent has been India's sphere of influence, but the Chinese doesn't see the Indian presence as exclusive, meaning that South Asia is not off limit to China. So when China looks at the smaller nations in South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Chinese see the need or doesn't see any need to be denied or any legitimacy to be denied access or influence or presence in the South Asian region. And that inevitably will lead to the Indian reaction seeing that China is trying to creep into India's backyard or sphere of influence. And I would say if the position of China and India were reversed, China would feel the same way about India. Like, for example, when we see India trying to pursue cooperation with Southeast Asian countries, especially, say, defense cooperation with countries like Vietnam, the Chinese are extremely nervous. They feel that India is trying to come to China's backyard and trying to steal China's sphere of influence. So I would say that in this case, I think the Chinese could have done a better job to reassure India about its benevolent intention and about the utility or the ambition of what they're trying to achieve in South Asia. But then, of course, if the Chinese agenda is indeed that, well, we want to compete with India for sphere of influence in South Asia, I think for them to clarify that, it probably is not going to be helpful either. I think the rising great power competition, as we say it, or the strategic containment of China, creates several momentum in China about its strategic environment. I think most directly, the Chinese reaction is that if US is trying to isolate China, then China cannot be isolated. Then by that token, China needs to improve relations, needs to accommodate its neighbors, and try to pursue a better relationship so that this separation, decoupling of the supply chain, the desire to decouple China from the international community would not be successful. It does apply to India, because if you look at the China-India rapprochement in 2018, remember the beautiful meeting between Xi and Prime Minister Modi in Wuhan near the Eastern Lake with all the cherry blossoms. I think 2018 really represented a pretty abrupt turn of China's policy towards India, especially after the Daklam standoff in 2017. And I think the primary reason that motivated that the Chinese abrupt turn of position is the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Is when China saw that the US is reaching out to India, offer India strategic leverages that New Delhi probably couldn't exist. China reached out to India to say that, well, we don't want to be alienated from you. We still want to build a good relationship with you. And if you remember, the Chinese leader elevated the China-India relations to an unprecedented level, calling it, I think, the unprecedented cooperation between two emerging powers facing this new century, something to that effect. So I would say that the logic, the first reaction that I mentioned, that China wants to avoid being isolated, it applied to India. But I think that lead to the second layer of reaction, which is that the Chinese saw that while US and China were competing for regional countries' favor, were carrying their alignment choices, what has happened, at least in the Chinese view, is that it inflated the demand of regional countries on China. And the logic became that, well, I'm just repeating what the Chinese are thinking, or what they see that happened with India, is that, well, India felt its external environment has improved to an unprecedented level. Therefore, both US and China were trying to carry favor with India. So in the Indian view, if China really wants a good relationship with China, then China should be more accommodating about the Indian requests. And the list of such requests is fairly long. So there's a border dispute, there's also the relationship with Pakistan, there's a trade relations, there's also the Chinese presence in South Asia. So I think in the Chinese perspective, the improved external environment of India has translated into a message of India's strengths. So India believes that its improved position has warranted more compromise, more concessions from China. So I think that's something that the Chinese felt that they couldn't deliver. And they're not going to, they want a good relationship with India, but they're not going to sacrifice their territory in their minds as legitimately Chinese territory to serve that purpose. And I think there's also a psychology in China that points to this unfortunate Chinese perception, which is that if China makes concession to India, because India is now in a better position, the Chinese concession will not be interpreted as Chinese goodwill. It will only be interpreted as a result of India's improved strength. So by that token, by that logic, India is going to make demands for more concessions, and instead of reciprocating to what the Chinese would deliver. So I think these are the, I call them stereotype thinking that China has accumulated through this many years of working with India, and they're unlikely to change in the short term.